Welcome to this video message on the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 21 through 25. In Matthew chapter 21, the kingdom is offered. It's unmistakable in the language, taken from Zechariah. Behold, your king comes to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt. And so the way Jesus does it, and the way Matthew tells it, makes it unmistakable that that's what's happening here. Jesus enters Jerusalem as king, offering the kingdom, enters Jerusalem on a donkey. And he is acknowledged as such by the crowds who celebrate before him. He exhibits his rule as king by entering the temple and cleansing the temple, casting out those who are buying and selling there. Incidentally, if you read it carefully, you'll notice that he overturned the tables of the money changers, so the money fell over, but not the tables of those selling doves. So the doves did not fall over in whatever cages they were in, the seats of those who sold the doves. So we see creation care from Jesus even in this little incident. And in addition to exercising his rule, he also was the king bringing salvation. He healed the blind and the lame. So here is your king, O Zion. Here he is, gentle and mounted on a donkey, bringing salvation and rule, coming to his temple. How will you respond to him? And sadly, although Jesus was acknowledged by the crowds, he was rejected by the mainstream of the nation. He was rejected by their indignation, like, what's going on? Don't you hear them calling you the Son of David? And then on day 2, by their questioning of him. And questioning isn't always for the purpose of learning. It's sometimes to cause entrapment or to bring opposition or to represent a reluctance to respond. And that was the kind of questioning that the Pharisees brought to him. So when he was rejected, the king withdrew. This is significant. Jesus came as king, offered the kingdom, was rejected and withdrew. And the next day he went to Bethany. An extraordinary miracle for Jesus. Jesus, whose miracles had all been miracles of healing and blessing and meeting needs. He went to the fig tree, which seems fairly obvious as a symbol for the nation Israel. There were no figs on it. He came, there should have been fruit from, there wasn't. He cursed the fig tree. So extraordinary to read of Jesus cursing something. So the rejection leads to destruction. And we see this in the next number of episodes here. Rejection of the kingdom leads to destruction, and the offer of the kingdom is passed on to others. And so he tells the story of the 2 sons. The man who said to his 2 sons, go to work today in the vineyard. And one said, yes, I'll go, but didn't go. The other said, no, I won't go, but afterwards he went. And this represents the people who did and didn't respond to Jesus. And they were surprising, because the Pharisees, who on the face of things were the ones who initially said, oh, we're good, we study the scriptures, we like to go to the temple, we're God's people. And yet when Jesus came to them, they said, no, we won't go. And the tax collectors and the sinners, the ones who exploited their neighbours and didn't seem to respond to God, when Jesus presented himself to them, they went, they said yes. So they turned from apparent no to yes. And so Jesus talked about this in the parable, the 2 sons, and the son who still hadn't gone still didn't respond. And so this was the rejection of the nation. And then he told the parable of the tenants. The tenants who were killers, the man who planted the vineyard and rented it out to tenants, and then sent his servants at the harvest time to get his share of the crop. And they beat them and killed them and threw them out and eventually killed his son. What will happen, Jesus said? He'll come and he'll kill those, and he will give the vineyard to other tenants. So a very strong theme coming through here repeatedly. The kingdom is rejected, and when it's rejected, it brings destruction, and the offer passes to others. And as we go into chapter 22, we see that same message is coming through again in the stories here. The banquet. The man who held a banquet for his son and sent the invitations to all those who were invited, said, it's ready now, you can come. And they said, excuse, no, this is more important to me. I've got some work to do. I've got some family things going on. I'm not coming to the banquet. So they didn't honour the king or his son who was getting married. And the king sent troops to destroy them. The consequences of rejection are destruction. And then the king said, well, the banquet's ready, so go and invite everyone, good and bad, bring them all in. And so everyone got invited, although it was still necessary for the new invitees to show respect for the son. One of them came without a wedding garment. So just because they're in the second round of invitations doesn't mean that they should disrespect the son as the first set of invitees had done. So that person was ejected from the banquet hall. So just because it's gracious and God's gift to us, it's not for us to be casual or disrespectful about the banquet that God has provided for us at great cost to himself. So then the Pharisees came to Jesus along with the Herodians, extraordinary, because they wanted to trap him. And so they asked him this question, should we pay taxes to Caesar or should we not? So if he said yes, he would be in trouble with the Pharisees. If he said no, he'd be in trouble with the Herodians. So they weren't coming to inquire and learn. They were coming to make him choose either A or B and so get into trouble. And so Jesus gave that wonderful answer, in which there is rich teaching. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God's. And give yourself to God because you bear God's image, the way a coin bears the image of the sovereign. So if the image of God is on you, give yourself to God. You're a human. Give yourself to God. It's the logical and proper thing to do. And then the Sadducees came to him with a question about the resurrection. This long story about the woman who married 7 different brothers, each of whom died in turn. You'd wonder why. But anyway, she married the 7 brothers. Each one died. She married the next one, the next one. And then they said, now in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And Jesus said, you don't understand the scriptures, the power of God, and that they won't be given in marriage in the resurrection. But in particular, Jesus said, but that there is a resurrection. Haven't you read where it says in the passage about the burning bush, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. The extraordinary thing about Jesus' answer is that he answered them from their own scriptures, because the Sadducees did not accept the prophets, but they did accept the Torah. And so he gave this extraordinary answer to them from the scripture that they recognized and acknowledged. And so the people were amazed at Jesus' answer. And then Pharisees asked him to test him, what's the greatest commandment? And he told them. And then Jesus turned the tables a bit by asking them a question. Now, see, they probably thought that, we can keep asking these questions. We can come back here every Thursday, and this Jesus person, he's quite a young man, so we'll have 10, 20, 30 years of coming and asking our questions. We'll entertain ourselves. But the time is limited, and they don't realise that. And when an opportunity presents to respond to Jesus, it's important to take that opportunity and not to use questioning as a strategy for delay, because the opportunity won't always be open. So it's important to move in and respond well. But Jesus closed it off by asking his own question again about the Son of David, that phrase which was part of who people recognized him to be, and what so offended the Pharisees because they recognized in it a claim to kingship. And so he said, the Christ, whose son is he? And they said, Son of David. Jesus says, why then does David call him Lord? And they couldn't answer that question. So we then move on into chapters 23, 24 and 25. And these 3 chapters make the final block of teaching in Matthew's Gospel. Just as chapters 5, 6 and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, make the first block of teaching in the Gospel. And both blocks of teaching, the first and the last, this is the 5th and last block of teaching, both of these blocks of teaching were addressed to the disciples and to the crowds. And while the tone in the Sermon on the Mount is positive, the tone in this last block of teaching is negative. And while in the Sermon on the Mount it's blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed, the repetitive word is blessed. In this final block of teaching, the repetitive word is woe, woe to you. So you can see the teaching has turned negative because the rejection has occurred. And so now the carrot was offered, is rejected. So now all that remains is to say, woe to you. And so the righteous options were given in the first Sermon on the Mount. But in this final block of teaching, the negative choices have been made. And things that were stated in the Sermon on the Mount are restated here, but restated in a negative way. So, for example, give in secret was a teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, but now it's you do all things to be seen by men. In the Sermon on the Mount, watch for the little things, but in this one it's you neglect the big things. The Sermon on the Mount, life can be chosen, and this is the theme of the Sermon on the Mount, be like this, life can be chosen, but now it's a case that judgment is inevitable. How will you escape the sentence of hell? And the chapter 23 finishes with the Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you stone the prophets and murder those sent to you. I often want to gather your children as a hen gathers chicks, but you were not willing. And so we see how the rejection has occurred, and Jesus is no longer appealing for their response. They have made their response, and their response is rejection. And of course, that is a necessary part of the path of salvation on which Jesus has embarked, because he is the priest who will offer the sacrifice of himself. But nevertheless, this response they have given to him, the response of rejection, is so marked in these passages here. Now, when we move into chapter 24, Jesus is speaking about the end of the world, or is it the end of their world? So there seems to be the case that Matthew has selected and conflated together material, maybe from different discourses here, about both of these. And remember, Matthew is writing this around 60 AD and selecting and presenting material that seemed most relevant to his hearers. So Jesus talks about, they talk about the buildings, the temple buildings, and Jesus says there won't be one stone left on another. So the destruction of the temple represents the end of that world, the end of their world of Judaism. And so Jesus also speaking about the end of their world, or the end of the world, talks about wars and famines and earthquakes and false Christs arising and persecution and apostasy. And in this part of the narrative, there's a lot of talk about delay. And of course, Jesus was crucified, rose from the dead 3 days later. The Spirit came just a few weeks later. So it seemed like, well, there's the Passover has been fulfilled. There's the Feast of Pentecost has been fulfilled. So surely the Feast of Ingathering, the final trumpet and the ingathering of the crop, the end of all things, surely it's going to come within a few weeks. And so the expectation was among the early Christians that, of course, Jesus coming soon. And by soon, we mean very soon. So soon that the Christians in Thessalonica, when they heard the gospel, a lot of them just stopped going to their day jobs. Like, what's the point? What's the point? Jesus is coming any day now. And so they had to be instructed to continue doing their day job. But in this narrative, many of these stories that are now told by Jesus and retold now by Matthew as he writes his gospel, they're about delay. Because the Christians were becoming dismayed. Thought, weeks have passed, months have passed, years have passed. Some of the Christians have actually died. We didn't think there'd be any more death. We thought Jesus would be back for us all. Now they've died. And so, again, elsewhere in the New Testament, they had to be reassured that those who died in Christ had fallen asleep and would be part of the resurrection. And so the message here is that while there is delay, we must endure. We must continue to serve faithfully, even though the master is absent or seems to be absent. And there are multiple stories here about this. The master is away. He's gone somewhere else. We thought he'd be home soon, but he's delayed. What shall we do? We must endure. We must keep faithful to do what has been entrusted to us to do and not become distracted. And so the story is of the servants. Blessed is that servant whom his master will put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time. So, but if the slave says, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to eat and drink with drunkards and beat the slaves, and then the master will return on a day he doesn't expect and will cut him in pieces and assign him a portion with the unbelievers. So there's this sense of it's important to remain focused. Although there is delay and Jesus hasn't yet returned, endure and continue to focus on what he has given you to do. And likewise, when we go on into chapter 25, and in some of these chapters there's apocalyptic language about the stars falling from the sky and so on, and just exactly how to interpret those, I'm not exactly sure, but how we are meant to behave Yes, we can be sure. That's spelled out clearly for us. So let's focus on what we're called to do. Even if some of the interpretations of how the events are to be timed or understood, even if that's not perfectly clear, let's be faithful to our calling. That's what matters most. So the 10 virgins, again, there was a delay. They're waiting for the groom, but there was a delay. And so they all became sleepy. And then someone said, he's here now. The bridegroom has come. And some were ready and some were not ready. Some had made preparation for the wait. And some had were only able to wait a certain time. And then they weren't ready any longer. So those that had made reserves says, we don't know when it will be, so we'll always be ready. And so those virgins went into the wedding feast and the others were excluded. Followed up by the story of the talents, the man who called his servants and gave them a different number of talents and went on a journey. And when he came back, he says, well, how did you get on? And one said, oh, I used the talents. And the other said, yes, I used the talents. And the other said, well, I just hid the talent. And the master was angry with that slave and said, you wicked servant, you should have used what I gave you while I was away, while I delayed. You should be using what I gave you. And so the lesson is very obvious to Matthew's readers then, around 60 AD, and now, that while Jesus yet tarries, while Jesus yet has not returned, it is our responsibility not to lose focus, but to endure through sufferings and apostasies and great trials, whether personal or in the world, and also to use what he has given to us, so that when he returns, he finds that we are faithful. We have continued to serve him, whether he seems to be watching or whether he seems to be absent. But we have been faithful to that. And then Jesus talks about the judgment throne and the sheep and the goats being separated at the judgment throne. And the king speaking to those on his right and speaking to those on his left. Both groups seemed surprised at how they were categorized. So a stern warning to everyone not to be presumptuous about our standing with Jesus, but he has called us to be sincere in our faith and to respond to him, to respond to Jesus, and to respond to Jesus as he is personified in his brothers, even the least of his brothers. So for Jesus' sake, we give someone a cup of cold water. That is Jesus. Okay, Jesus seems to be absent, but he's not absent. He's present in the person of this person in front of you who is needy, who needs something. And the way you respond to them is how you express your response to him. And so those who visited those in prison and gave them to drink and clothes when they were naked, Jesus said, you did that for me. You did it for the least of my brothers, so you did it for me. So we're taught to be merciful, to live lives consistently with the message of the kingdom, not doing things for show or not doing things for people who can pay us back, but by genuinely sharing love as God does to us. And the way we respond to Jesus' brothers is the way we respond to him. And then he says, and these will go into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into everlasting life. So he calls us in a very sobering way not to be presumptuous about our standing. As the Pharisees, we see, were presumptuous about their standing. But we then, who come in the Christian age afterwards, we can also become presumptuous about our standing and presume that we're much farther ahead in our relationship with God than perhaps we are, and to rely upon our membership, or, well, we believe certain things, but we don't really pursue those things. We say we believe certain things, but to take to heart the person of Jesus, the brothers of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, respond from our heart and demonstrate that with our actions, and continue to do that even while Jesus seems to be absent, that we don't lose heart because of delay, but we continue faithfully pursuing Jesus, his teaching, and serving him, and walking in the ways of the kingdom that he has brought us into by his grace.